On March 26, 2026, 6 days after the Wahiawa Dam nearly failed and 5,500 people fled the north shore of Oahu in the dark, the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources Board met and voted to take the dam away from Dole Food Company. It was the right decision. It was also, in the language of disaster economics, exactly 48 years too late. Because while the dam was dominating the headlines, the dramatic water level readings, the 85-foot crest, the 1/500 gallons per second pouring over the spillway, the imminent failure notice at 8:30 in the morning, something else was happening across the Hawaiian Islands that has received almost no coverage. 19,190 properties were damaged by the March 2026 flooding across all 5 major islands, not in the evacuation zone, not in the national seashore, in neighborhoods, in houses, in the homes of families who had been told by their mortgage lenders that they did not need flood insurance because they were not in a designated flood zone. Only about 2% of properties in Hawaii carry flood insurance. FEMA estimates more than 400,000 properties statewide do not have coverage. AccuWeather, 400,000 properties. No coverage. And the storm that just proved those properties are not safe from flooding was still producing landslide hazards when the FEMA application window opened. Stay with me, because the Wahiawa Dam story has been covered. The 48-year warning, the $20,000 fine, the WPA dunes that locked the island in place, the perverse insurance incentive that rewards owners for waiting. All of it documented in previous coverage. But the story underneath all of it, the story that the March 2026 disaster is now forcing into the open, is about what 19,190 damaged properties means in a state where 8% of them had no insurance to cover the loss. And there is a date on a government document, a date that means something specific for every homeowner in Hawaii who just survived the worst flooding in 20 years without flood insurance, June 10th, 2026. That is the date the new FEMA flood insurance rate maps become effective on Oahu. The maps that redesignate 3,500 additional parcels as high-risk flood zones, properties whose owners are now legally required to buy flood insurance if they have a federally backed mortgage. The disaster proved the maps were right. The maps became effective 79 days after the disaster. And the homeowners who just had their houses flooded are now being told to buy insurance for the risk that just materialized. That sequence, flood first, map second, is not a coincidence. It is the operating pattern of American flood risk management. And in Hawaii, it just played out at a scale that the entire national flood insurance system was not designed to absorb. First, what the March 2026 event actually was. Because the single storm framing that most coverage used is wrong. The March 2026 impacts were driven by 2 back-to-back Kona Low systems rather than a single storm. The first Kona Low stalled northwest of the islands during roughly March 9th to 15, repeatedly pulling deep tropical moisture into the state and producing multiple waves of torrential rainfall and embedded thunderstorms across the major islands, alongside damaging south to southwesterly winds. Just days later, a second Kona Low arrived around March 19th, bringing another round of heavy rain onto already saturated watersheds and elevated stream flows. NBC 6, South Florida, 2 storms, 5 days apart. The first one soaked the ground. The second one arrived before the ground could drain. Meteorologists recorded repeated bands of heavy rain and thunderstorms, with 5 to 10 inches over much of the state and 15 to 25 inches in parts of Maui and the Big Island, with locally higher totals above 30 inches. The storm produced damaging wind gusts in the 60 to 75 millimeter range, with local gusts above 100 mph on the Big Island. NBC 6 South Florida, 30 inches of rain in some locations, on ground that was already saturated from the previous week. Governor Josh Green called it the worst flooding in Hawaii in 20 years. WGCU. And then the North Carolina State University dam failure research finding from the previous script applies here with mathematical precision. Most dam failures occur after moderate rainfall events that accumulate over 5 to 30 days. Not a single catastrophic storm. Sequential moderate events. Saturated ground, elevated reservoir. The 2 Kona Lows produced exactly that sequence. And the Wahiawa Dam's reservoir filled to 85 feet. 3 feet from catastrophic failure, not because of one extraordinary storm, but because the ground was already holding all the water from the first one when the second arrived. Here's the number that changes this from a dam story to a statewide disaster. Further analysis revealed that the flood damaged a total of 19,190 properties. Oahu sustained the heaviest impact with 12,634 damaged properties. The storm also damaged 3,656 properties on the Big Island, 2,506 on Maui, 582 on Molokai, and 12 on Lanai. Local 19,990 properties across 5 islands in a state with a total housing stock of approximately 560,000 units. That is 4% of every home in Hawaii damaged in a single 2-week flood event. Totality data shows that approximately 62% of residential properties in the affected areas have a first floor height between 1 foot and 5 feet. Because most of these homes are built relatively low to the ground, they are highly susceptible to interior water intrusion. Floodwater only needs to rise slightly more than a foot to breach the main living spaces of these properties. Local 10-1 foot. The margin between a normal heavy rain and a flooded living room in 62% of Hawaii's affected homes. Not a catastrophic dam failure, not a 10-foot storm surge. 1 foot of floodwater finding its way through the foundation gap of a house built low to the ground, the way most Hawaii homes are built, in a climate where the outdoor living space is part of the design. In '95, 8% of those properties had no insurance for what just happened to them. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. The FEMA flood insurance rate maps for Oahu were being updated throughout 2024 and 2025. The process was long, technical, and largely invisible to most homeowners. From 2019 through 2024, FEMA studied flood risk along numerous streams across Oahu, many of which had not been studied before. Using the study's findings, FEMA released an update to flood insurance rate maps on Oahu. The finalized maps and the letter of final determination were issued on December 10, 2025. The letter states the updated firms will become effective on June 10, 2026. The Watchers. December 10, 2025. The maps were finalized. The effective date was set, June 10, 2026. These updates are crucial. Due to these map revisions, some parcels may now be designated as high-risk flood zones, known as special flood hazard areas, for the first time. Properties newly mapped into a SFHR require specific building standards and may be subject to mandatory flood insurance requirements. WGCU mandatory flood insurance requirements for 3,500 new parcels, starting June 10, 2026. The maps were finalized in December 2025. The flood happened in March 2026. The maps become mandatory in June 2026. Some of the 3,500 parcels, newly redesignated as high-risk flood zones, are properties that flooded in March. Their owners are now learning, through letters from their mortgage lenders, through calls from insurance agents, through the Hawaii Insurance Commissioner's Bulletin issued this spring, that the federal government has determined they are in a high-risk flood zone. The flood happened first. The official designation that they needed insurance came after. The city and county of Honolulu has stated, if you are required to have coverage and have not purchased a policy within 45 days after the effective date, your lender may force place a policy. This means you would have no control over the policy cost or coverage terms. WGCU force-placed insurance. The lender buys it for you at whatever rate they choose from whatever insurer they select if you don't buy it yourself within 45 days of June 10th. The most expensive, least competitive version of flood insurance imposed on homeowners who just had their properties damaged, who are already filing FEMA assistance claims, who may already be in the FEMA disaster loan process. Here is what the March 2026 disaster produced at the level of specific places, because the island-by-island breakdown tells a story no aggregate number conveys. The Manoa flood on Oahu. Damages estimated around $85 million, with major losses on the University of Hawaii at Manoa campus. Approximately 120 homes were damaged. Floodwaters pushed vehicles into the trees downstream from the Woodlawn Drive Bridge. NBC6 South Florida, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the flagship campus of the state's public university system, the place where Hawaii trains its teachers, its engineers, its nurses, its lawyers. $85 million in damage in a single flooding event. In a campus drainage corridor that the Manoa Valley has flooded before, in 2004 when a previous flood damaged homes and a university library. Southeast Big Island flood. Damages estimated around $70 million, largely to roads and bridges. Nearly 300 homes were destroyed or damaged, and more than 2,000 disaster assistance registrants were reported. Kamohana Avenue, a major thoroughfare in the city of Hilo, was severed by massive flooding at the Alanaio Stream Bridge. NBC6 South Florida, Kamohana Avenue, the road that connects residential neighborhoods in Hilo to downtown, to the hospitals, to the schools. Severed by flooding at a bridge over a stream that flows through the center of the city. 300 homes destroyed or damaged on the island that already hosted an active volcano and a previous catastrophic flood history. Oahu, New Year's Eve. Flood. Extreme rainfall over East Oahu triggered devastating flash flooding and debris flows. Property damages were estimated at $35 million, with more than 500 homes damaged or destroyed and roughly 2,800 people evacuated. NBC 6 South Florida. That was a separate event, different storm, different date, not March, New Year's Eve, $35 million, 500 homes, 2,800 evacuated. Hawaii had a $35 million flood on New Year's Eve and a $1 billion flood in March, in 4 months. Here is what is not making headlines. The FEMA Major Disaster Declaration that President Trump approved on April 15, 2026, the one that authorizes federal assistance for the March flooding, has an application deadline. Individuals and families who sustained losses in designated areas should first file claims with their insurance providers and then apply for assistance online at Disaster Assistance. The deadline for applications is June 14, 2026. DeSantis Daily, June 14th. The application deadline for FEMA disaster assistance for 19,190 damaged properties across Hawaii, 4 days after the new flood insurance rate maps become mandatory for 3,500 Oahu parcels. In a state where 8% of properties have no flood insurance, where 19 to 190 properties were damaged in a single storm event, where the FEMA individual assistance grants, the payments that help families pay for temporary housing, home repairs, and uninsured losses, average roughly $5,000 to $8,000 per household nationally. Not enough to rebuild a flooded home, enough to buy time. Flood insurance coverage across the state remains low. Only about 2% of properties in Hawaii carry flood insurance. FEMA estimated more than 400,000 properties statewide do not have coverage. In an event like this, where flood losses can be widespread but highly localized, low take-up can slow household recovery, increase reliance on limited public assistance, and increase the likelihood of uninsured losses for homeowners, small businesses, and the agricultural sector. NBC 6, South Florida low take-up, slow household recovery, increased reliance on limited public assistance. That is Guy Carpenter, one of the world's largest reinsurance brokers, describing in actuarial language what happens when 8% of a state's properties have no flood insurance, and the worst flood in 20 years damages 19,190 of them. The families in those 19,190 homes are recovering right now. With FEMA grants that average a few $1,000s, with no insurance payout, with uninsured losses that represent, in many cases, the largest single financial loss of their lives. Here is the infrastructure math that nobody has assembled. The Wahiawa Dam was built by the Waialua Sugar Company in 1906. It was operated for sugar for 90 years. It was transferred to Dole when Dole absorbed Waialua's operations. It was fined $20,000, the maximum penalty under state law, for documented deficiencies in 2021, and the state board voted to acquire it on March 26, 2026. Practical resilience actions identified in the aftermath include real-time reservoir and stream monitoring with reliable telemetry, clear operational triggers for spillway releases and evacuation thresholds, downstream inundation mapping tied to operational scenarios, and well-practiced emergency action plans with coordinated public communications, Local 10 real-time telemetry, clear operational triggers, downstream inundation mapping, well-practiced emergency action plans. None of those things were fully in place on March 20th, 2026. The evacuation order came at 8:30 a.m. after the water had already reached 85 feet. The city re-evacuated 186 people and 45 dogs from Waialua High School to higher ground in Wahiawa because the shelter itself was flooding. The primary access routes to Haleiwa and Waialua were already underwater when the imminent failure notice went out. The state acquired the dam. The repair cost is estimated at $20 million. The FEMA public assistance that was just authorized will reimburse state and county governments for emergency response and infrastructure repairs. But the acquisition cost and the spillway upgrade are infrastructure improvements, not emergency response. They may not qualify for full FEMA reimbursement. The 19,190 families whose properties were damaged in March are applying for FEMA individual assistance. The state government is navigating how to fund a $20 million dam repair with emergency infrastructure appropriations. The 400,000 uninsured properties are being told to get flood insurance before June 10th. All three of these financial pressures, household, state, and statewide, trace back to the same root cause. This event is a reminder that Hawaii's flood risk sits at the intersection of extreme rainfall, sea level rise, and aging infrastructure. Even without attributing any single storm to climate change, warmer air can support heavier downpours, and rising sea levels can worsen coastal drainage and backwater conditions, making it harder for stormwater systems and streams to discharge during high tide periods. NBC 6, South Florida. 3 intersecting trends, all of them accelerating. None of them visible in the Wahiawa Dam water level reading that the entire coverage focused on for 5 days. Now, pull back to the financial picture. 19,190 damaged properties. 2% with flood insurance. That means approximately 18,388 of those properties had no coverage. The average flood loss for a residential property is difficult to generalize. It ranges from a few $1,000s for minor water intrusion to hundreds of thousands for complete structural loss. But the Guy Carpenter report characterized the overall state damage at potentially exceeding $1 billion. Spread across 19,190 properties, that averages roughly $52,000 per damaged property. Multiply $52,000 by 18,288 uninsured properties. The result is approximately $956 million in losses that will fall on individual households, on state and county emergency assistance, on federal disaster grants, and on the charity organizations that set up collection drives when the cameras arrive. What will not cover it? Flood insurance. Because 8% of Hawaii's properties do not have it. Even if your property does not require flood insurance, it is still recommended to talk with an insurance agent since every property has flood risk. The Watchers. Every property has flood risk. That sentence is from the City and County of Honolulu's official flood resilience guidance. It is on their website. It was there before March 2026. It is there now. 19,190 families just learned that it is true. The FEMA flood insurance rate maps that become mandatory on June 10th were designed by FEMA after studying flood risk along numerous Oahu streams that had not been studied before. The study ran from 2019 through 2024. It identified new high-risk areas. It redesignated 3,500 parcels. The flood that proved those parcels were high risk happened before the mandatory date by 79 days. So ask yourself 3 questions. Only 4. 2% of Hawaii properties carry flood insurance. FEMA estimates more than 400,000 properties statewide have no coverage. The March 2026 flooding damaged 19,190 properties across 5 islands in a state where the governor called it the worst flooding in 20 years. The FEMA individual assistance grants that the Presidential Major Disaster Declaration authorized average a few $1,000s per household nationally. Sufficient for temporary housing and basic repairs, insufficient for structural reconstruction of a flooded home. The uninsured loss across 18,288 uninsured damaged properties is estimated near $1 billion. FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program was designed to fill exactly this gap. To provide affordable coverage in flood-prone if, 8% of Hawaii's properties are uninsured against flood, despite living on islands surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. In a state the governor just confirmed suffers the worst flooding in 20 years from a single storm sequence. What specific failure of the NFIP marketing, pricing, and mandatory coverage framework produced that 2% uptake rate? And who is responsible for changing it before the next Kona Low? A Local 10, FEMA finalized updated flood insurance rate maps for Oahu on December 10th, 2025. The maps become effective June 10th, 2026, redesignating 3,500 parcels as special flood hazard areas requiring mandatory flood insurance for federally backed mortgages. The worst Hawaii flooding in 20 years damaged 19,190 properties in March 2026, 79 days before the maps became mandatory. Some of those 19,190 properties are among the 3,500 newly redesignated parcels. Their owners are now receiving lender notifications requiring them to purchase flood insurance after their homes already flooded, with the FEMA disaster assistance application deadline of June 14th running 4 days after the mandatory insurance date of June 10th. The sequence, flood, then mandatory coverage, then application deadline, means homeowners are simultaneously navigating a disaster recovery process and a new insurance mandate. Who designed that sequence? And what is the specific assistance available to homeowners who are newly required to purchase flood insurance in the same 90-day window they are recovering from a flood that their previous non-coverage made catastrophically expensive? WGCU. And if the back-to-back Kona Low pattern, a saturated first storm followed by a second storm hitting had already full watersheds and reservoirs, is the specific meteorological mechanism that brought the Wahiawa Dam within 3 feet of catastrophic failure in March 2026. And climate scientists project that warmer Pacific Ocean temperatures will support more intense and more frequent Kona Low systems in coming decades, and 120 of Hawaii's 131 state-regulated dams are in poor or unsatisfactory condition, with most privately owned by entities whose maximum regulatory fine is $20,000. What is the current state inspection schedule for the 119 dams that are not the Wahiawa Dam? And which of them sits upstream of a community whose evacuation routes flood before the imminent failure notice can be issued? Right now, the FEMA disaster assistance application window for the March 2026 Hawaii floods is open. The deadline is June 14th, 2026. Applications can be updated with additional information if the situation changes. DeSantis Daily, 19,190 damaged properties. Application deadline, 38 days from today. Updated flood insurance. Rate maps for Oahu become effective June 10th, 2026, 34 days from today. Properties newly mapped into high-risk flood zones may be subject to mandatory flood insurance requirements. If required coverage is not purchased within 45 days of the effective date, Lenders may force place a policy at any cost, under any terms. WGCU, 34 days to the new flood maps, 38 days to the FEMA deadline, 4 days apart for the same homeowners, in a state where 8% of properties had no flood insurance when the worst storm in 20 years arrived. The Wahiawa Dam has been transferred to the state. The spillway repair is planned. The $20 million upgrade will eventually be completed. The 120-year-old earthen structure that Dole Food Company owned, deficiency noticed, minimally maintained, and offered to donate in exchange for having taxpayers fix it, is now a public asset. One dam out of 131 regulated dams in Hawaii. 120 of them in poor or unsatisfactory condition, most privately owned. In Haleiwa and Waialua on March 20th, 5,500 residents received an imminent failure notice at 8:30 in the morning. The evacuation routes were already underwater. The shelter at Waialua High School was already flooding. The city re-evacuated 186 people and 45 dogs to higher ground. The dam held because the rain stopped, not because the spillway was adequate, not because the deficiencies had been fixed, not because the state owned it yet. The rain stopped. The reservoir dropped from 85 feet to 82, 6 feet. And the 5,500 people who had been told to flee came home to find out what a house looks like when a historic flood reaches your street but not your door. 190 families on 5 islands found out what it looks like when it reaches the door. 8% of them found out without insurance, and the maps that would have told them they were at risk became mandatory 79 days later. The next Kona Low is already forming somewhere over the warm Pacific water. It has no application deadline.